May God remind us who we are and send us out in love. Amen. Perhaps you heard this story this week, or maybe you even saw the video clip. Former police officer Amber Geiger, a white woman, had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder of Botham Jean, an African-American man. He was shot and killed in his own home when Amber Geiger mistakenly believed him to be an intruder, when in fact she was intruding into his home. And as the concluding part of this trial, Botham Jean's younger brother, Brant, was giving testimony in a victim impact statement when he turned to the judge and asked him a very unusual question. He said, "I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please?" And he stepped off of the witness stand and hugged the woman who had murdered his brother. He said these words, he said, "I forgive you, and I know if you go to God and ask him, he will forgive you." He said even more, "I think giving your life to Christ is the best thing Botham would want for you." It was a moment that captured the hearts of many folks watching. A hug in this offering of forgiveness to someone who had hurt him so deeply. However, I came to discover this week that there was another story to be told. The story was less heartwarming and full of forgiveness and more difficult, especially for a white audience. Bree Newsom, who became a nationally known figure when she climbed a flagpole in South Carolina in 2015 and pulled down a Confederate flag. It's how she became a national figure. Bree Newsom, she tried to draw people's attention to a different video from this week. A video that told a different story about this trial. The other video was of Botham Jean's mother outside the courtroom speaking after the conclusion of the trial and sentencing. She said in her public remarks, in part, "There is much more to be done by the city of Dallas. The corruption that we have seen during this process must stop." And she added, "It must stop for you. After now," she said, "I leave Dallas, but you live in Dallas, and it must stop for everyone." Black academics and activists and leaders have noted this week that white people like myself in the U.S. often demand and expect Black people to forgive and to forgive and to forgive. And I think that that's why the first video of forgiveness became so popular. The second video, though, harder to watch because it spoke of a harsh reality of injustice and racism for African Americans, and it called for much, much more work to be done. For us this week, from our various backgrounds and experiences, I think it's worth considering both videos. An image of powerful forgiveness from Botham's brother, and for my sermon this morning, the deep lament and call to action of Botham's mother. Botham Jean's mother's call to do more, I'm going to call it a Mordecai moment. A Mordecai moment is a crisis where in deep pain and anguish and lament, someone calls us to do more, to be more, to prevent further destruction and loss of life. It's a Mordecai moment, because this is what we see from Mordecai in today's first reading from the book of Esther. He calls for action and resistance to the evil proclamation sent out to destroy the Jewish people. And I wrestle with these texts this week, much in the spirit of Rachel Helen Evans in her book. And I want to be honest that I held out hope that these texts would bless us with both forgiveness and justice. And the story of Esther is a challenging one and a beautiful story. God curiously, is not mentioned in this book of the Bible. Esther is an orphan, a foster child, and a woman. And even as she struggles with how to share her faith with those around her, she's part of the Jewish community. Mordecai, in the story, is her cousin, who actually becomes her guardian and caretaker. And they live not in the Jewish homeland in Jerusalem, but in this foreign land, occupied by the rule of the Persian Empire. And before the first reading, Esther, before that story in the first reading, Esther is drawn into the world of the king's harem after the king becomes very unhappy with his previous wife. And she is, however, forbidden to speak with the king without a summons. Those who approach the king without an invitation are to be put to death. There is but that one law. And no one in the palace knows that she's Jewish. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, also finds favor with the king after preventing an assassination attempt. But here's where the story shifts. Mordecai runs into the villain of the story, Haman. Jewish audiences, when they read about Haman, the villain, will boo when his name is said. A senior advisor to the king is Haman, and Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman when Haman walks in front of him. And this is where the evil gets out of hand. Haman turns his anger from this one moment into a hatred of all Jewish people and convinces the king that they should all be killed. And that's where our reading picks up, with this terrible, terrible news that the king has called for the destruction of all Jewish people. Mordecai learns this and is distraught. He puts on garments of sackcloth and heaps of ashes and goes through the city wailing. Jewish scholars refer to this mourning and lament as an act of public protest. Wherever people found out why Mordecai was weeping, they too wept, lamented, and fasted. And eventually Mordecai gets to Queen Esther and calls her attention to the crisis. This is that Mordecai moment where he calls for action. He tells her, in a way, don't think that you'll escape the fate of your fellow Jewish people because you live in that nice palace. You can't keep quiet. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. It's a call to action, and Esther courageously rises to the moment, and she does save her people. But before she makes the decision to approach the king, even at her own peril, recognizing that it could mean her own death, there's a small note in the text. It says she fasts and calls the whole community to fasting. She claims her Jewish identity. She dives deep into who she is and considers how to respond to this Mordecai moment. And that's what struck me about the faith of Queen Esther when faced with a serious, insurmountable, a perilous calling for her life. She's drawn back to a fast. And I can only imagine how Esther might have used her time during that fast. Maybe she wailed, cried, like Mordecai had. Maybe she prayed for guidance or strength. Maybe she found ways to remember that the God who was faithful to Hagar in the wilderness, the God who liberated her people from slavery. Maybe she drew her mind back to her God whose faithfulness was everlasting. And I've already seen and heard faith-filled responses in this community, much like Esther's faithful response. When this community was increasingly confronted with a Mordecai moment, this ongoing crisis of the hatred and degradation of LGBTQIA+ people, this community withdrew, prayerfully and guided by our ancestors in faith, guided by the witness of Scripture, and guided by the presence of God in the font and at the table, and chose to become a reconciling Christ congregation, and affirmed a welcome statement for people of diverse gender expressions and identities, and for people of diverse sexual orientations. It's the kind of careful consideration that Esther shows us. And so as we go on in our lives, consistently finding ourselves, each of us in our own Mordecai moment, crisis moments where an entire people is facing destruction, I can imagine indigenous people crying out about the destruction of the earth, black communities crying out against the destruction of their lives, people with disabilities crying out for accessible spaces, transgender people crying out for the right to live safely. As a community, we can make room for lament and fear when we see the destruction of our neighbors. We can call our whole community back to who we are, just as Esther did. God calls us back to this fight, to remember that we're nothing less than beloved children, wholly loved always and forever. And if you're here this morning reeling from the destruction of your people, maybe you too are wearing sackcloth and ashes, you're mourning, or you're in protest. We as a community can respond like Esther, to listen and to act faithfully with you. And when we respond to these crisis moments, we do so together and reach out in love in response to how much God loves each of us. And we struggle to balance forgiveness and deep, lasting justice. But we don't need to fear messing up too bad. We don't need to fear doing the wrong thing or falling short, or even fear our own peril, our own loss of life. Because God, in death and resurrection through Jesus Christ, has crushed death and evil for each of us, so that we might live not in fear of messing up or fear of falling short, but so that we could live our lives in service to our neighbor. Amen.